Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. I hope you don't have to be too patient. Patience was never a virtue at Atari. It was all about impatience and getting things going. And for those, I don't know how many of you know me, I'm Howard Scott Warshaw. I was a game programmer at Atari in the very early 80s. I did Yar's Revenge, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., and Saboteur. Most of you know about E.T., which was the fastest video game ever developed. Nobody knows about Saboteur, which is the slowest video game ever developed, because I did that back at Atari, but it wasn't released. It was released 20 years later. So I had a 5-week game and a 20-year game, so I pretty much covered the range. I am currently a psychotherapist in Silicon Valley, and I'm the Silicon Valley therapist. That's what I like to say. And a lot of people ask me often, how do you go from being a programmer to being a therapist? That doesn't seem like a natural transition. People ask me that a lot, and what I hear when they ask me that is, oh, programmers have no people skills. So how do you do that? And I was always a people skill person who could program. But in my experience, I don't really find it that big a shift. Because if you think about it, programmers and therapists, we're all systems analysts, right? It's just that I've moved on to a more involved hardware in the human brain. So I've done a lot of different things also. I've had career changes. I've programmed all over the Valley in all kinds of endeavors and all kinds of areas. I'm an award-winning filmmaker. I did some documentary films. I'm an author. I've written several books. I enjoy speaking. And, I was a real estate broker for a while too. I had a real estate broker's license. I always like trying new things, incorporating new skills and talents, and cultivating new skill sets, and wrapping those in together. And the great thing about being a therapist is that's the one thing I've ever done that incorporates absolutely everything I've ever done. Because when you're a therapist, everything you've ever done becomes relevant. If the next client who walks in, you may be able to match their experience. Whatever's going on for them, if I've had that experience, that creates connection and allows me to understand where they're coming from more quickly. So when you're a therapist, if you have to go to a therapist and spend 2 or 3 sessions explaining your life situation before they can start understanding and helping you with it, well, that's just more expensive. So I like to save people time. So, and Jeff was kind enough to mention, I did write a book. So my wife says I have to do this right away. This is my book, Once Upon Atari. This is me on my 25th birthday. No, that's not me. I didn't bring audio visuals. So this is Once Upon Atari. This is the story of me at Atari and beyond and what went on, because Atari was an amazing adventure. If you really want to know what it was like to work at Atari day to day, I did a documentary series that was on PBS called Once Upon Atari, just like the book, but this is very different content. This is all the people who worked in the VCS department at Atari, plus Nolan Bushnell, talking about what it was like to be there and the day-to-day things, the fun stuff, the horrible stuff, the scary stuff. All of those were there. Because at Atari, you never knew day-to-day what was going to happen. Every day was a very strange and potentially emotionally volatile day. It could be a massive success and you discover something that made the coolest thing in your game and you knew was going to propel your game into the stratosphere. Or it could be that, wow, we're not sure if we're still going to be here tomorrow. We had a lot of days like that too, because Atari was a very volatile environment. The only thing you didn't really have at Atari was sensibility. Nothing really made sense, because Atari was never about making sense, right? Atari was about making fun. It was an orgy of creativity and outrageous behavior that was all about, how do you, if you think about it, as a game designer, nowadays when people work in games, well, everybody who works in games now grew up with video games. You know what video games are. They spent time as a kid fantasizing about being a game maker. That was a thing that was there. Everybody at Atari, there was no video game thing, you're gonna be a video game maker and stuff. It was the last place that people worked where everybody who worked there didn't have video games as a kid. You know, I grew up wanting to be a film director, among other things. That was my big dream. So when I got to work with Steven Spielberg, that was really weird. That was really weird. You know, it's interesting to meet your idols. And it's strange to meet them when you've got to do work for them. And it's stranger still when the work you've got to do for them is a derivative of their work, that you're going to be judged on how well your work emulates their work, when their work is an international smash success. So that's just the pressure. And the pressure was a big part of what happened at Atari. So I want to talk some about what I call the Atari DNA and how that led to things that happen all over the valley, because the Atari DNA carried a very specific message. But I also want this to be a very interactive experience also. So, well, we have some mics here. If you want to ask questions, you have questions at any point, I don't have to just hit here and yak and then wait. You have to wait. If you have questions, bring them up. I'm totally okay taking questions. Just want to put that out there. So, but the Atari DNA, what was the DNA of Atari? The thing that was amazing about working at Atari was everyone who worked at Atari knew one thing. We knew that you can make a product that can change the world, that it's that close, it's there. The thing about a video game is it only takes one person to make it. Right? Most products, especially most manufactured products, require a vast array of people and input and design innovations and a lot of stages, and there's many hands involved in the construction. A video game, it's one person, at least back on the 2600, it was one person. It was one of the biggest innovations that happened while I was there at Atari was they hired a graphic designer. And that was the first time anyone else was contributing anything to a game that someone was making. And then later on, there were some sound people, so you could get some sound bites, and people would pop in with sound. But the beauty of working at Atari was that it was one person, one game. So I also worked in games. I worked in games for many years, on and off. Now a game is a collaborative effort. I mean a console game, right? A huge console game. It's a collaborative effort. There's hundreds of people involved in it. So the analogy I like to use is like an ocean liner. You know, doing a console game now is like an ocean liner. And the great thing about an ocean liner is you can have a lot of fun on an ocean liner, and you can carry a lot of stuff on an ocean liner. You can have supplies, and you can be set, and you can have all kinds of people, and you can have an amazing thing going on in an ocean liner. The one thing you cannot do in an ocean liner is make a sharp turn. You cannot veer. You cannot suddenly go in another direction. When you want to turn in an ocean liner, you've got to prepare for that a couple of miles in advance and do it very slowly. Some people like that. I hate that. I can't stand the idea of being stuck on a path and you're just going to ride and wait to see what happens. I like the idea of something that's dynamic. And the thing at Atari, it was like being in a speedboat where you can't carry a lot of stuff and maybe you can't go forever, but you can make a turn anytime you want, and you suddenly see something over there and I want to go there instead, boom, you go there. And that kind of dynamism, the idea that your game wasn't done until you stopped working on it, as opposed to when it fully matches the spec that was written a year ago. That's a very different experience. Some people call it the difference of a collaborative effort versus a work of authorship. But it was that sense, that work of authorship. The other thing we got at Atari quite a bit was dry mouth. So there's this idea that one person can sit down for months at a relatively inexpensive development station and make a product that could generate millions and millions or tens of millions of dollars in profit. That's another thing that's very unique in business, It's very rare that, an individual for a short period of time can generate a product that generates that much revenue. It usually takes a lot more people. Once the game is done, you turn it over to a manufacturing monster, right? Which back then, this was all pre-internet. So there wasn't like dropping the game and getting feedback and then dropping updates and things like that. No, you had one shot. Whatever you did, you made it, you put it out, it had to get put into physical cartridges that went out, and it was never going to get updated. So there was also that pressure. You have to do it once, get it right, and once it's out, it's gone. You're never going to, well, theoretically, you're never going to deal with it again. The E.T. game disproved that theory. You still deal with it for years after. But that idea that one person can literally generate a product that changes things, and that a product can change the world. Right? Video games existed before Atari for a little while. There were such a thing as some video games, mostly Pong variants. What Atari did was made video games a worldwide phenomenon. They were the first console to hit the stratosphere, like to really go off. At a time when IBM had sold a total of 10,000 PCs, and that was their big mark. We've hit the 10,000 mark at PCs because they wanted to put computers in homes. Atari had put 4 or 5 million computers in homes. They just didn't sell them as computers. They sold them as games. So it turns out games are the killer app for home computers. Because when home computers were first coming out, well, why do I need a computer? For recipes? That was the big thing. Oh, you can keep it, you can catalog your recipes and you can have them all there and you're all set. And then you can write a letter. You can type it up on your computer and print it out. And a lot of people found that the time it takes to start up your computer and type it in and edit it and get that going and then get your printer and then you have to remember the paper and to get that fed and get all this stuff together. How many of you know the term dot matrix? Right? Yeah, that was a long time ago. And for a lot of people, they would say, well, why would I write a letter on a computer? It's actually faster for me to sit down with a pen and paper and write a letter, which was true. They didn't get the idea, well, okay, now send this letter to 50 people. It's a lot faster with a computer. But this was what was saying, here's why you need a computer. And then video games came along, and now people got it. Oh, I don't need a computer, I need a game system. And so one thing Atari did was they actually put computers in people's homes by the millions, when the major home computer manufacturers were only doing it by the thousands. So that was high impact. But this idea that you can change the world with a product, everybody at Atari had that idea. They knew that, they had that feeling. And then Atari, which was such a, bacchanalian experience. It was such a crazy and wild place. And a place like that, that's that imbalanced, can't stand for long. And of course, Atari collapsed, at least the games and the coin-op games moved on. Lived on. But the home games and the home computer, those things fell apart. They crashed because inevitably something that imbalanced cannot stand. So when that happened, I was at Atari. When I got to Atari, there were about 1,800 to 2,000 employees. And I was still at Atari when there were 12,000 employees. And then I was still at Atari when there were 200 employees. And that was just before the Trammels took over. And we actually have one of the Trammels who took over right here today. Leonard, who is an amazing guy. But there was an amazing shift what happened at Atari, what went on. And it was because everything was falling apart. Atari literally fell apart. And when it did, 10,000 people who had this idea that, yes, we can make this work. I can do something that's going to change the world. Not only that, but it's going to make us rich and it's going to make us famous. Right? All of that's Atari DNA. And now you have 10,000 people spread across the valley in all kinds of places, all kinds of departments with this idea, which is exciting. And a lot of people say that was a major contributor to the dot-com bubble and ultimately the dot-bomb, right? Because they all went out, and then suddenly there was this whole field, a whole bunch of startup and pop-up companies, because once the web really started to catch on and people started to realize you can monetize the web and there were ways to do this, and investors got wind of it, that was very exciting. It was very exciting. And so suddenly a lot of money poured into the idea of startups that'll do that, which was very much like what happened in video games. If you look at what happened in video games in the early 80s, it's very much like a precursor to the dot-bomb situation then, right? What happened, a lot of people, what caused the video game crash, right? I come here as the programmer of E.T., and I ask you, what caused the video game crash? And of course, a lot of people, everybody knows E.T., the E.T. video game caused the video game crash. Well, that's handy, and it's nice, and it's convenient, but it's not true, right? The whole E.T. fiasco cost maybe $50 million, and not that much. E.T. still sold 1.5 million units after returns and stuff. So they got the profit from 1.5 million units. They spent money on advertising. They made too many units. But all in all, you total it all up, they didn't lose anywhere near $50 million. This is at a time when the video game industry is $4 billion. A lot of people don't realize that, but already by 1981, the video game industry worldwide was bigger than movies. It was bigger than the movie industry and the music industry combined. It was already past that. It just never got the recognition in that regard. But everybody loved video games. But what happened at Atari was they didn't keep the secret inside and they didn't lock the box, right? What happened was the VCS, the 2600, was made not in the model of a computer video game console. It was made in the model of a phonograph, right? Phonograph doesn't care what record you put on it. As long as it's got a groove that'll hold a needle, it'll play. Phonographs don't know how to tell what record it's playing and to make a decision about playing it or not. And the VCS was basically a phonograph in that regard. Now, as we all know, a computer is smart enough to do that, to see what kind of game you're asking it to play and make a decision to play it or not. But they didn't do it for whatever reason. And it's kind of ironic in a lot of ways, because one of the things Atari was really known for, another aspect of Atari DNA, was the idea if you can't beat them, sue them. And that was part of the cultural transition, because the real story of Atari is a story of a cultural shift, right? Because with Nolan Bushnell, there was a culture of creativity and science and engineering and innovation first. And that's a great way to go. And working with Nolan is a lot of fun. He is a wacky, wild guy, and he demands that you come up with stuff. And if you're the kind of person, what I always like to say is there's two kinds of people in business, right? There's people who make things, and there's people who make money from people who make things. And if you're a person who makes things, I have a feeling at a conference like this, it's going to be heavily slanted towards people who make things, right? As opposed to the people who make money from people who make things. And so every company starts off with people who make things, because if you don't have a thing, you don't really have much of a company. But what happens is, as you make a thing and you start to sell it and you start to move it, if it succeeds, if it's doing well, what happens is the engineering doesn't need to grow that much. You just keep making things. But the sales and marketing grows very rapidly, which they need to, and they scale up, and there's more money spent on those departments, and then suddenly, initially, here's your engineering budget, and here's your budget for marketing and everybody else. And then as the company starts to succeed, suddenly you flip your mic, and you find that engineering doesn't take up that much space. And management in a lot of companies, when they look at where they need to pay attention, they look at where they're spending the most money, which makes sense. But if you're suddenly spending the most money everywhere other than engineering, you're not going to pay as much attention to engineering. And engineering starts to lose its say, and the company becomes dominated by people in marketing and sales. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't have to be. Theoretically, they're all cooperating. But another piece of Atari DNA was that engineering and marketing don't have to get along, right? In fact, they can be way at odds. Because what was interesting about Atari was that the only people who actually played the games or were into the product were in engineering. Virtually, it was almost nobody outside of engineering was actually playing the games. One of the classic stories was Rob Fulop, who's a guy who's done some remarkable games throughout video game history. He was working at Atari, and he did the game Night Driver. Now, he was working on it, for the home version, and a marketing guy comes in and says, "Wow, that's an amazing game." He goes, "How did you think? Where did you get the idea to handle the screen like that?" And Rob had to tell him, "Well, this is Night Driver. It's our number 3 coin-op." He was doing the home version of one of our top sellers, and this marketing person was unaware of the games that were actually selling. And that was just like kind of a shocking thing. And so the idea that there was no interest in the product and no awareness of what was going on, yet there was a lot of demands. Okay, they would still dictate what had to be done, what was on the schedule. It was frustrating. It was very frustrating. As the people who make things, it is hard sometimes to respect the people who make money from people who make things if they have no idea what's involved in making things. So that's a thing that happens in companies to this day. There's a lot of things. I talk a lot about the interdepartmental mess that went on at Atari in my book, and what I hear from a lot of readers is, wow, this is exactly what's happening in my company. And that's true. It's true because, people don't learn. A lot of times. It's easy to keep making the same mistakes as long as there's enough money to keep paying your salary while you're making the same mistakes. And then when there's no money left, you go to another company and make the same mistakes. That's the way a lot of people go through their career. It's an amazing phenomenon. I just think and it's something we see all around us in life today, right? Learning from mistakes. But learning from mistakes is what life is all about, theoretically. I like to say that we enjoy our successes, but we learn from our failures, or we don't. It takes effort and attention to actually benefit from the stuff you've done in the past that hasn't worked. For most people, it's easier to keep doing what you're doing as long as you can still find a way to get paid for it. And I know most of us see this going around. So there was this kind of conflict, the idea that I expect to have an issue or be opposed by other people in my company as opposed to cooperate with them. That was part of the Atari DNA also. And sometimes I wonder how many interdepartmental relationships got undermined unnecessarily because of the expectation that that's the way it's going to be, as opposed to the actuality. Because when you introduce that, if you come in with a hostile attitude in any kind of interaction, usually that's what you're going to get back, right? But, we always are the product of our experience, right? Which comes to the question of, can people change? As a therapist, of course I believe people can change. It'd be a horrible therapist if you're a person who really believes, no, people can't change, but I'm still willing to charge them for as long as they'll show up. But human beings as a whole, I don't think do change that much. What changes is the toys we play with. But human nature doesn't really change that much over time. And that was one of the main reasons I moved on to becoming a therapist, is because working in tech, it's murder keeping up with tech. You have to relearn everything every few years. It's a pain in the ass. And what I found is when I switched to being a therapist, people are still people. They have the same problems, the same issues, the same things that go on, and I can help them deal with it. And that's fun, and I don't have to relearn everything I knew every few years. To me, I got tired of that. It's fun for a while, but it lost its power to charm me. So, but what else? Early Atari under Nolan was all about creativity, it was about fun, it was about being outlandish. Nolan understood that engineering needs to be a separate part of the company in something like this. What's the difference between making a video game and other kinds of tech? Right? Many of us are in tech, some of us are in games, but there's one really huge difference between programming in general in tech and programming for a video game. And it's about the spec. It's about the spec you have to meet, right? Most of programming comes down to, here's a spec, write a program that meets this spec. That's programming. And there are varying degrees of difficulty, but the truth is when you just have a flat spec that says, I want it so that when you flip this switch, this light comes on. That's basically a programming spec. And that's not that hard. It's not that hard to meet a spec in code. Video games have everything in their spec that any other technical endeavor has, but they have one extra element that you never see in any other technical spec. And that is that when you're done, people have to like it. It has to be fun. What's the last time you said, oh man, this C++ compiler, so much more fun than Word. I love this. That's it. And when you add that particular parameter into a spec, wow, you're not just changing the experience of doing the program, you're changing who you need to be able to meet that spec, right? And we used to talk about this a lot at Atari, like what's the difference between a programmer and a game programmer, particularly a successful game programmer? Someone who can actually sit down, spend the time that it takes to do it, and at the end come up with something that people actually think is fun. Not even all the game programmers could do it, right? That's why there were coin-op conversions also, right? You don't have to be able to do it every time to have been a game programmer at Atari, but to do original games, to create new gameplays and stuff, then you had to be able to do that, right? So it wasn't that there was no place for someone who couldn't do it, but if you're gonna innovate, the next game, the next cool thing, you need someone who can do that, someone who has the technical acuity, because it was a very annoyingly intricate hardware. And it was very difficult. Having to keep microseconds rather in your mind while you're programming to make sure your code is in sync with the electron gun as it's scanning across the screen, which is where we were at the 2600. So you gotta be a little torqued in the head to find that fun in the first place. But then to take someone who's at that level of nerd, okay, and then say, but you have to do something that everybody's gonna think is fun to get involved in and do. So we used to talk about it, it's a combination of silly and anal. That's the two things. You gotta be pretty anal to really keep all of these details. In fact, like everybody who programmed the 2600 knew all the registers. They knew the bit pattern of every opcode, okay, on the machine, because there were times where you could save a cycle or two by using the fact that I know that the bit in the status register happens to match the color on bit in another register, so I could point my stack pointer into the hardware register and do a pop operation, and it would actually set the register instead of having to load an accumulator and then pick a new address and then do a store operation, which takes so many cycles and you've already missed, your opportunity on the screen. That's the kind of thinking that went on in programming the VCS. So, yeah, and I was definitely that nerd. And it was fun. It was fun to do that. It was fun to come up with a creative way to do it. But then there's also the bigger picture of, but when you do that, you get it all set, and then you call in, like 11 or 12-year-olds, and they're sitting there with their greasy hands from all the pizza you filled them up with, and they play the game for like 2 minutes, and they throw the controller. This sucks. What a piece of crap this is. And they're right. They're right. And to sit there behind the mirror, because that's what you do at a focus test, right, is you go in there and you're sitting behind the mirror and you are watching these kids playing your game and you're thinking, oh God, I hope they like it. What does it mean if they don't like it? Because I have like 6 months, 8 months, 10 months of really intense work and labor riding on this. And if they don't like it, that's all for nothing. Most people don't hand their destiny over to, early adolescence that way. But that's what it was. And so how do you deal with that? For one thing, you have to try and meet the challenge. You also have to withstand the pressure and the tension. And not everybody did. Because another thing that happened at Atari that I've never seen happen anywhere else is there were more nervous breakdowns. More people just lost it at Atari than any place I've ever worked, which was astounding. I don't know how many of you see nervous breakdowns on a semi-regular basis at work. It's not a typical thing. It happens. But at Atari, it happened fairly regularly. You'd go into someone's office and they would just be staring blankly at the screen. And they had been doing that yesterday afternoon when you saw them, and you're coming in the next day, and they're still there. And then later that day, you see people come in and remove them from their office and take them to Agnew's, which is an institution that doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be a sanitarium. And that happened multiple times at Atari, because while it was really fun and wild and we were rolling around and just doing all kinds of crazy stuff, because what does it mean to do research for a new kind of gameplay in video games? What does that mean? It's an interesting question, I think, to wrestle with, which we did. Here's the idea is that, let's say you have a spec for a game and you got a budget for a game, you're gonna do this game, we're gonna program for 10 months, and that game will be done, and you get it done, and it's within budget, and everything's great, and then you put it out, or you test it, and everybody says, this sucks. I don't want to play this. I don't want to buy this. Okay, so what happened with that budget and that 10 months? Was that time wasted? Was that time used effectively? You certainly didn't achieve what you were looking for. Now, suppose you spend 2 months screwing around, just doing any kind of crazy stuff you do. And by the end of that 2 months, you've come up with an idea for a new play. And then you spend 7 months implementing that play, and it's a great game and people love it. Okay, well, that's great. That's great. That's a great success. Let's do that again. Maybe. It's interesting. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to screw around for 2 months and then do your 10-month schedule that you already planned on and deliver that 2 months late and over budget, and nobody likes it. That you definitely don't want to do. But the point I'm making is that what constituted productive versus unproductive time at Atari was a very difficult thing to conceive. It was not difficult for marketing to look at us and go, you guys are just screwing around. You guys are wasting time. Oh my God. We have licenses you guys could be filling. But yeah, fill them with what? Don't we need a game? Well, we got the license, just put something out. That was a common conversation at Atari. Another problem you have with people who make things, people who make money from people who make things. Okay, well, let me go to the level before that. Everybody thinks what they do is great, right? In a business, you run into the phenomenon in a lot of cases where everybody believes what they do is the key thing and they do it great, and everybody else needs to get out of my way and let me do this for all of us, and we'll all be better off if you just get out of my way and let me do what I want to do. That's great, except everybody thinks that way. So I call it egonomics, right? It was the idea of corporate structure where you have an engineering department who says, leave us alone, get out of my way, we're gonna give you a product, you're gonna make so much money from it, you're gonna be so happy, and haven't we done this before? So just shut up and get away from me and let me give you a game, and I'll let you know when it's there. And that's engineering. That's some engineers. Then there's marketing. And marketing goes, we can sell the crap out of anything. So just give us anything. I don't care if it's crap, we'll sell it. We can sell the hell out of it. So just give us something and we'll sell it, but give it to us on time. Because if you give, every week you don't have this out, that's a week of sales that we missed that we will never recover. We will never get that back. And then engineering hears that and their response is, well, if we give you a piece of crap and people see that you're willing to put out a piece of crap, not everybody thinks that just because it's a game, it's great. And if we get the reputation for putting out crap, we're not going to be able to sell the next game or the next game or the next game. And that's true. But one thing you learn as a therapist is people say stuff, and it's not necessarily what they really mean. Not that they don't mean what they said, but it's not an accurate picture of what they mean. So when engineering says, we don't want to get the reputation for putting out crap, what they're really saying is, you're asking me to do something I wouldn't be proud of. And I don't want to do that. And I don't want my professional peers to think I can't do this. You know, I don't want to be a joke in the industry because you needed to sell something right away. Because when you add this idea that it's got to be fun, you have to have the kind of people who believe they can create fun. And the kind of people, you've probably heard a lot of stories about people in entertainment, you know, people who are stars and how they have a lot of attitude and stuff. And, you know, there's stories. You know, there's a lot of stories about how people who are creative people, who are very productive creative people, have a lot of attitude. And the truth is, you know, a lot of those stories are true. You know, there's a lot of attitude because it takes, to be able to do that kind of work and to commit to doing that kind of work takes ego. Takes a lot of ego. I used to hear lectures about egoless programming when I was in school. And I always thought, egoless programming, what a great idea. Let's, you know, egoless programming. You shouldn't be worried about getting criticism or, you know, feedback on your code and stuff. That makes perfect sense. But I don't think you produce really innovative and interesting stuff if you don't have the inherent belief that you really can do it. You know, if I have years of experience writing code in a certain language, in a certain application, it doesn't take a lot of ego to say, yeah, of course, I can do what I do well, and I will do it well again. Okay, because it's a known problem to solve, and you've solved it many times, and so one more problem like that, no problem. You know, I'll solve that. When the problem is do something that has never existed before, when that's the problem, there is no real experience that can say for sure you're going to be able to do it next time. You know, you didn't know you could do it the first time. It worked. And then it works again, and you get excited. And then it works again, and then you start believing it yourself. And it creates ego. Some people are able to cultivate ego without doing anything, right? You know, and I'm not saying that makes for a great programmer, but the people who were working there had succeeded. And they had seen others succeed. And so you get to a place of attitude. And that attitude isn't necessarily helpful, but it's there. And it's sort of a part of the DNA, right? That's part of the attitude. You have to have people who believe they can do something really cool before you're going to get people who can do something really cool. And not all of the people who believe they can do something cool are going to really do something cool. And even the people who can really do something cool aren't going to do something cool all the time. Holy crap. Okay. So, and when you hear people say, just give me anything, and you have that kind of ego, it hurts. it hurts because what they're also saying is we don't believe in you. We don't believe in you enough to give you a little extra time to do something better because that'll increase our sales. We just need to get it out because it doesn't matter what you've got or what you're doing. What matters is what we'll do with it. So you have engineering who thinks, look, leave me alone. We'll get you something that's worth selling. And then you got marketing who says, just give us something. We'll sell the hell out of it. You're wasting time and you're costing us money not putting this out yet. And then you got management. And management is sitting there going, holy crap, these engineers and marketeers, they're all insane. We got to do something to get them to actually produce something that's worth selling and making money because we have to pay people salaries. And if nothing's happening and we're not getting anything out, this isn't going to work. What are we going to do? And that's what happens when you're in a new business. Because Atari in video games was the first time a major console succeeded, and it posed a whole new business challenge, a whole new business. I mean, nobody knew it. So a lot of people say the reason for the crash in the early 80s was the ET video game, which is patently absurd. But it's okay, it's a simple explanation. Nolan Bushnell said in the Once Upon Atari DVD, he says, a simple explanation that is clear will always have more power in the world than a more complex one that is true. And I think that also to me is the essence of conspiracy theories, right? It's the idea. You have some simple tagline about something that explains it so everybody thinks, oh yes, I've got the answer. How many people want to do the work to really find out what the truth is so that they can do better next time? No, most people like to get something for nothing. And when you just have a simple epithet that explains something, you get the feeling that you understand it without having had to do the work to comprehend it. So, okay, that's human nature. It makes sense. It just isn't very productive. And so, I can give you a one-line explanation, a very simple explanation of why the video game crash occurred that is actually true. And here it is. It was the first product life cycle of a video game console that succeeded. That is it. Because I don't know how many of you know the name William Goldman. He was a Hollywood screenwriter who did movies that many of you I'm sure have seen but don't remember the name of the person who wrote the screenplay. And William Goldman had his first law of Hollywood. And his first law of Hollywood is nobody knows anything. Every major Hollywood studio rejected Star Wars. They all threw it away. They all had a shot at it. Everyone said, no, sci-fi's dead. That's nothing. We're not going to pick this up. They threw it away. Fox picked it up because they had a contractual obligation to deliver 3 films in a quarter, and they only had 2. So they picked it up because they had to pick something up. They weren't happy about it. Nobody knows anything. You know, they also funded Waterworld as the most expensive movie ever made at the time, right? There's plenty of stories. There's also a saying in Hollywood that goes, nobody ever got fired for saying no, right? Is that it's okay to refuse things and reject things where you really, the big sin is doing something that doesn't work. So if the big sin is doing something that doesn't work, it takes courage to stand up and innovate, to try and say, yes, I will do something that'll work, knowing that you are inheriting all the negative attention if it fails and all the consequences. So that kind of courage was also rampant at Atari. Some people would call it hubris, because sometimes it is hubris. But sometimes you need that. You need that to be able to attempt to succeed, and then you need talent and ability to actually succeed. And where do you find people who are full of all that kind of stuff? Well, one place you found a real concentration of those kind of people was Atari. And that's what made Atari such an amazing place to be, an amazing place to work. I'm starting to run out of time here. Are there any questions? Really, this presentation was unquestionable? Here we go.
All right, so if you have a question, hold on.
What would the ET game have been like if you had had more time to work on it?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I actually have a subchapter in my book that's about what would I have done differently with ET. I broke it up into several categories. The first was what would be if I had one more day. As many of you probably know, at a time when games took 6 to 8 months to make, I was given 5 weeks to do the ET game, just 5 weeks. Which also, the idea that when you know a product takes that long to make, the idea of signing a contract and paying $28 million for the privilege of using it, knowing you're only leaving 5 weeks for the product development, that's an interesting comment on management thinking at that time. And that also explains partially why there was a great video game crash. But if I had one more day, the first thing I would have done was, I'll tell you what's wrong with ET. There's a number of things that are wrong with the ET game. But the main problem with the ET game is it violates what I consider to be the fundamental rule of video games. And that is, in a video game, it is okay, in fact, it is necessary to frustrate the player, but it is not okay to disorient a player. You should never disorient it. Like, it's okay to, here's the cookies. I see the cookie jar, but I can't reach it. Okay, that's frustration. Disorientation is where I go into the kitchen to get a cookie and I wind up in the garage. That's disorientation. And there are too many places in the ET game where you wind up in somewhere where if you're not really familiar with the game, you don't understand what happened and you don't know how you got there. And nobody comes into a game understanding the game. So the first thing I would have done was done some things to eliminate the chances for that to happen or to reduce the incidence of it, right? If I had 5 more days, if I would have had basically 1 more week, which would have increased the schedule by 20%, then I would have done things. I might have put in actual verbal instructions as to what your goal are, because there were ways I could have inserted a little bit of text, and that would have been revolutionary. And I also would have doubled down on reducing the number of times you wind up in a situation not understand it. Another thing, I'll tell you one thing that a lot of people complain about, the collision detect in ET. And I have to say this, the collision detect in ET is perfect. It is a hardware collision detect. It can't go wrong. The computer circuit would have to be broken before the collision detect doesn't work. It is not a technical problem. It is, however, a perceptual problem. One of the things I always wanted to do when I made a game was I wanted to break new ground. I want to innovate. That was important to me. Even ET in 5 weeks, I still did a game. I did the first game with a 3-dimensional play space, right? Because ET is placed on a cube. It was 3-dimensional. I had different goals. I had location-specific powers and things. These were all things that had never been done in a game before. But the thing about ET was I also created graphic potential to really unleash the talent of Jerome Demurit, who was my graphics designer, because by the time I did ET, I had a graphics designer. So what I did was I tried to maximize the resources he had to put good graphics in the game, and he did. He did a great job on the graphics in the game, and that was a big problem. Now, I'll tell you why that's a problem. Because, in the game, I'm scrambling to do something. And one of the things that passes for gameplay in ET is the idea of having to navigate through those wells, right? You have to navigate through the pits. And some of the places, it's like a choke point, and that's intentional. Now, most games you play, when part of one character touches another part of the environment, you go, oh, I touched that, well, there's going to be a consequence. The problem that occurred with ET was when the tip of your head touches one of the wells and the collision detect, which is perfect, goes off and says, oh, you have collided, and I throw you into the well. People go, hey, you don't fall into a well when you touch your head to the well. You fall into a well when you touch your feet in the well. And they objected to it because then that means your collision detect doesn't work. But think about what's really happening there. And I had to become a therapist to really understand this. I'll tell you. I also want to say, I have to tell you, it's a matter of truth, is a lot of people say that one of the reasons I became a therapist was to deal with the trauma and the depression that my ET game generated. And I won't disagree with that entirely. But what it really says is that the graphics on the 2600 were so good that people bought into the character. They actually believed this is a person running around, and they expected the game physics to reflect real life physics, right? How many 2600 games encounter that problem? I don't think that many. So in some ways, I was cursed with such a great graphics designer who actually made something so good it made people buy into the characters, and that was one of my design goals. I wanted to have more character and have something people identified with, and oops, what can I say? So I definitely would have fixed it so that you have to get your feet in, or you have to have more of an overlap before you fall into it, which would have reduced the gameplay. I might have made the wells bigger and cover more space on the screen to compensate for it, because I still wanted there to be some hand-eye coordination necessary to play the game. But that's a couple of problems. And then if I would have had an extra month or two, I would have redesigned the entire game. I would have totally done a different game. But because the thing with ET was, when you have to do a game in 5 weeks, you don't say, okay, I'm going to do a game that takes 6 months and jam it into 5 weeks, because that's pure failure. That's just stupid. And I try not to be stupid. I do not always succeed. Ask my wife, she will tell you. But I didn't want to just cause an instant fail. The problem in doing a game that quick is not a programming problem. It's a design problem. Whereas ordinarily when you do a game on the VCS, it's a voyage of discovery. Right? You start off doing it, and you keep doing stuff, and you test it, and you play it, and you try new stuff, and you throw some stuff away, and you keep other stuff, and you enhance the game. And when the game gets good, that's when it's done. The variable is time, right? Quality is the goal. So what I did was I said, I don't have time. So now what's going to be the variable, unfortunately, is the quality of the game. I'm going to pick a design that I can execute, that I'm confident I can execute in 5 weeks and get it done, and within that constraint, I'm going to try and make the game as much fun as possible. That's what I did, and that's what gave me the confidence to say, yes, I can do a game in 5 weeks. That, and I was so full of myself at the time. I'd already done Yar's Revenge, which was like the most successful original game on the VCS, and I did Raiders of the Lost Ark, working with Steven Spielberg, which was the first movie to game conversion. And at that point, and then Steven Spielberg asked personally for me to do this game, which was totally unnecessary, right? Because nobody else was going to try and do this. I was literally the only person in the world who was even willing to attempt this. And I have proof. Because I'll tell you, when on the third day of the schedule, right, which is already over 10% like into the schedule, I show up at a department meeting, and they announce that I'm doing ET. And it's announced to the whole department, Howard's going to do ET. And everybody's grumbling, oh, Howard gets to do all the good games, and blah. This was only the second movie title. But it's like, here's, oh, Howard gets to do it, and then grumble, grumble, grumble. So I stood up in the meeting, which in and of itself was not that unusual. And I said, hey, this game, this is on July 30th. This was on my 25th birthday. Okay, this is July 30th. I stood up, I said, hey, this game is due September 1st. Anybody who wants it, raise your hand, you got it. Crickets. It was nothing. Nobody ever, nobody, in 40 years, no one has ever come up to me and said, oh, I wish I had gotten to do ET. That's never happened. There was never another word about, oh, Howard gets to do these games. After a couple of weeks, what I did start hearing is, oh, Howard's insane. Howard's crazy. And then a couple of weeks after that, what I started to hear was, uh-oh, what if he doesn't? You know, what does that mean for the next schedule? And that was scary to a lot of engineers at Atari, for good reason. But Atari was an amazing place. You can learn about me and Atari and Once Upon Atari, How I Made History by Killing an Industry. And this is my book, and it's available on Audible as an audiobook. If you like the dulcet tones, I was the one who read the book. I would not trust anyone else to read this book. There are too many double meanings in it to allow that to any other narrator. And this is my documentary series, Once Upon Atari, which is everybody who worked there telling you what it was like to work there. And I have copies available, a limited number. I'll be at the table right outside the door. If anybody wants to get something autographed, if you want to buy one of these, I'll make you such a deal. And I guess I pretty much got to get going now, right?
We can take one quick question and then we've got to finish up.
Does anybody have a quick question? Right here. That was kind of a long answer.
It may take a little bit to answer this, but we did a storage locker cleanout for a guy who wrote How to Win at Video Games, and we found a bunch of prototypes and unreleased games and things like that in there. And I was wondering, do you know what the interaction is between you as the programmer and outside people in getting feedback from them, if that was the case, or if this guy just had an inside connection to get these unreleased games?
Well, this guy probably had an inside connection. There was some very famous dumpster diving that went on in Sunnyvale at one point, because as Atari was shutting down and cleaning up, there was a lot of stuff that got thrown out and dumped. And I know people who went dumpsters all over Sunnyvale looking for Atari detritus. It could be one of those. There were also people who stockpiled little ROMs. You know, we would create EPROMs, you know, erasable, programmable, read-only memory modules that would just, of games in various stages. And I knew people who had like shoeboxes full of various ones. They would just grab them and hold them and stuff. So some of those could slip out. There were a lot of places something like that could have come from. It's interesting, and now they turn out to be historical relics, you know, which is kind of interesting. But does that answer your question? Yeah. Oh, that was a quick one. I'm surprised I didn't go on for another 5 minutes on them. But
All right.
that's it. Thank you so much for being here, and if you want to chat, I'll be right outside.